Well, thank you, everyone. It is certainly an honor to be a part of the BTS Symposium in 2017. Today, I would like to kind of shift gears a little bit from some of the more broadcast-centric topics that you have heard over the last couple of days and talk about cybersecurity from the standpoint of hopefully some practical approaches to begin implementation or how to implement what is really a very complex subject that, of course, the broadcast industry has not necessarily dealt with that much in the past, although there certainly have been recent events that have been in the news headlines. The Equifax breach is one of those, but maybe some others that have not been necessary in the national media have been like the ransomware incident of KQED in San Francisco. So with that, certainly the broadcast plant has changed, is changing. I don't need to convince you of that, but what it has changed from is from a traditional infrastructure to basically it's an IT infrastructure. So that traditional rack room now looks more like a data center because it is a data center. And with that comes some of the headaches that often come that have plagued the IT industry for, gosh, the last 10 plus years as security became a focus area. Obviously, we've transitioned a lot of services to a cloud-based infrastructure, beginning with storage. Of course, now that may mean transcoding, it could be captioning generation, in several forms of the traditional services. So we all will become heavily involved and keep up with service-based architecture and approaches. Well, we talk about data breaches and credit card numbers and all of this sort of thing, but how does that really fit into the broadcast? Well, the risks that often come from the broadcast are one that we all work very hard to prevent, and that is dead air, or in some cases, a different program than you may intend to broadcast, or that impact on the resources. So there are some specifics to broadcasting that we want to work to prevent. So cybersecurity is simply a very broad subject that is to protect that IT infrastructure, and of course our broadcast plant today is becoming of that. So a place to start, because there is a pattern to cybersecurity attacks, and that pattern is first to stop the reconnaissance or the probing, in other words, the exploration of a network infrastructure. As Barney Fife would say, you want to nip it in the bud. So at that level, if you can prevent that probing of the network, then that's really that first prevention step. And that's really where we want to focus on with network security. So when we talk about a secure network, we all have secure networks, right? We're not going to admit that we don't have one, but what does that really mean? Well, the industry has established there are some goals to achieve. First, we want to provide confidentiality of the data. We want to provide integrity of that data and also provide availability of our resources, or in this case, our network resources. And that forms what is often referred to as the CIA triad or triangle. Also not to be confused with a certain three-letter government agency sort of up the road from us. Sometimes you'll see this also referred to as the AIC triads, just to kind of avoid that confusion. But there's really three main goals we want to achieve. With that, we have, again, focus on protecting that infrastructure. We want to protect it from that exploration or that espionage. And there's common threats. There's a handful of them out there. And of course, there's a lot of considerations to take into play in implementation. One of the first, though, is to know your enemy. In other words, know the tools that your enemy use. And in one example, in a little bit, I'll talk about one of those, quote, hacker tools that we want to use as a prevention tool. So with that, again, we all have secure networks, right? Well, what does that really mean? The industry has adopted some attributes that are associated with a secure network. The first of those is to utilize in a design of a network a segmented or a layered approach. You'll hear different terms associated with that. Simply means to separate functional areas of your network, not only for security, but that's also a design practice that is for performance as well. And as a broadcaster, we deal often in real-time media. That is our data that we transport, and that performance is very important to us, again, because of the nature of that real-time media. So we can also take the approach of this segmented or layered network infrastructure that also provides us some advantages from the security aspects by establishing these layers or zones as security domains. In other words, a grouping of host devices that have similar attributes in terms of administration, in terms of needs. And with that, we establish privilege levels, all built around kind of a need to access concept, very similar to the top secret type clearance or a need to know. We want to focus around a need to access, and then by default deny everything and only make exceptions when there is that need to access. Certainly we want to control the access to our infrastructure. That's primarily would be done through some type of authentication means. And then we also use tools that are available to us, the firewall, of course, being the most common, to help control that access. And then finally, an attribute that is often overlooked is the active monitoring or logging of events. In other words, if there is an event that occurs, you have monitoring that hopefully can help quickly identify an event and also enable to reconstruct, with the idea to take that reconstruction and help basically prevent a future breach. So one description is that Cisco often uses in their literature is the defense in depth, which is really not necessarily a new concept, but maybe a new concept applied to the IT infrastructure, is to implement multiple layers. Basically, take the approach or the design that is used in a castle. There's multiple layers that must be breached to reach finally the internal or the core of that castle infrastructure. In our case, that's the core of our network. And thus, again, we have this layered type approach. Okay, all sounds good, some principles to work from, but how do you really go about implementing this, particularly in a broadcast environment, which could be a corporate station that has an IT department that runs everything, but think about the small radio station and maybe there is one engineer that kind of handles everything. So one approach I'd like to suggest is simply follow the OSI model, which is the kind of framework that networking is built on, in particular following the data flow layers of the OSI model. And to do that, that kind of provides us a structure or a guidebook to follow. So the first, of course, is the physical aspect part where we control physical access to the network infrastructure. And with that is simply done through, again, locking mechanisms as simple as a small station with a wall-mounted rack cabinet that is locked, that has access, like your data switches and so forth, to obviously the other extreme is the data center type environment. And again, the logging and the monitoring of that is very important as well. The other is to implement at layer 2. Remember, we're going to follow the OSI model. So at layer 2, we'll utilize features of our network infrastructure. In that, we'll use security features of an Ethernet switch that has capability to control the host device that is actually hooked to a given switch port. And with that, we can utilize that. If something foreign is attached to that switch, we can, one, simply discard those frames. Ideally, we want to send notifications to the network administrator or the broadcast engineer to know that something is being tampered with, and simply shut down that port. Again, we've prevented the access to the network infrastructure. At layer 3 and above, we want to simply use features of our network infrastructure, and that's going to become doing packet filtering. That may be done simply through an access control list or an ACL, or utilization of a firewall, and then finally encrypting communications between our network devices. An access control list is simply a very basic packet filter. Two types of filters, the standard and the extended. The major difference is the capabilities or the type of information that can be filtered. That information is all within that layer 3 IP header information. Implementing an access control list, there are some rules that must be followed. One of those, you can only have one access control list per interface direction per protocol. Well, for practical purposes today, our protocol is the IP protocol, as we're really not dealing in multi-protocol networks anymore. So we simply can have one access control list. Remember, interfaces are bidirectional, so there's an ingress and an egress side. And of course, we can filter, which filtering is either permitting or denying on basically the information that's contained within that IP header information of that packet. So we create an access control list, then we apply that to a specific interface. A simple example is simply blocking someone from the public internet to explore my network by using the ping utility. The ping utility, of course, is based upon the ICMP protocol, or the Internet Control Message Protocol. And we do that by simply creating an access control list and then applying it to the interface that will simply block ICMP. So we've taken away that ability for someone from, in this example, the public internet to go explore my network infrastructure. However, internal host devices can ping each other for troubleshooting and so forth. The firewall is, of course, the most common device, in this case, a layer 3 device. An access control list basically is a stateless firewall capability, in that the features or the filtering is on a fixed basis, whereas a stateful firewall is aware of the conversations that are going on between two hosts and can take that into account, particularly on that return conversation. And of course, firewalls can be hardware type devices. We can implement access control list in a layer 3 router. And of course, there's common software available to take a host device with the appropriate network interfaces and basically create your own firewall. At the same time, simply having a firewall is really not enough, because there are some cautions. Often there is false security placed upon the firewall, particularly a firewall that was put in and forgotten about, because there's an active approach to things. Often, because of ease of administration, there's a tendency to put all the hosts behind a given firewall zone for ease of administration. Once again, that sort of breaks that multi-layered or multi-zone approach approach. And with that, in determining the setup and configuration of that firewall, although we're going to deny everything and only permit certain things, there really needs to be some policy that is guiding that. Well, in a corporate environment, yes, there'll most likely be a very, very formal policy. But in a smaller environment, maybe that policy is generated with yourself. It could be just simple, these are the formal rules that I'm going to follow. And then finally, once again, because we are broadcasters, we deal with real-time media, there is throughput to consider in terms of performance of the hardware aspect of that firewall and also latency concerns. In other words, there have to be enough hardware resources or computing resources in that firewall device to accommodate, again, typically our real-time media. And then finally, don't overlook the egress. Firewalls have tended to focus on ingress, but don't forget the egress. Be a good network citizen. In case there is something breached in your infrastructure, it's not being used to impact someone else. And then finally, implementing basically IP security or IPsec, which is available, whether we're talking an IPv4 environment or an IPv6. You might have heard comments that IPv6 is more secure than IPv4. That's sort of true in that in IPv6, IPsec was mandated. That was later in the standards or the RFCs changed to a recommended practice. It's really not more secure because it's the same whether it's IPv4 or IPv6. It's just the fact that it is being implemented. Two different modes for IPsec, either the tunnel mode or the transport or host-to-host payload more. And if, excuse me, effectively what happens is we're going to take the IP packet, we're going to encapsulate a new header on there, and then encrypting the remaining the portions of that packet. So if we look at threats that are common to a network, again, there's a very, very long list of those. They generally fit into three generic categories, and these are where we focus upon the prevention steps to do that. If we want to do some network hacking, we have an enormous amount of resources that are available to us. And this particular one website is one of those that as you're exploring sometimes, just get a feel for the number of tools that are readily available to us. In this list, in each of these categories, you will find multiple options, let's say, for tools to become a hacker. And if we look at the most popular of 2017, these are the most popular tools that are out there. In the interest of time, I want to spend a little bit and talk about one of these really, really quick, and that is nmap, or Network Mapper. And it is a tool used by hackers. It's also a tool useful to the broadcast engineer to evaluate the security of a network. Several things it can be doing. We can use it in a positive manner to diagram maybe an unknown network infrastructure. We can determine information about active hosts within that network. Several different commands. This is just a subset of some of the type of things you can do with nmap. And again, a subset of, I think the last time I counted, there was well over 125 individual commands. Earlier on, I used an example to block an ICM ping from someone externally exploring my network. Well, there are other ways to explore a network. And of course, that is one of those features or capabilities of nmap. And we often use a lot of icons and images of a hacker that is, always a dark room, always wear a hoodie, right? Well, in reality, that's not what goes on in the world. More than likely, it's a host device in a data center environment that is running scripts, that is exploring the network infrastructure. And one of the powerful aspects of nmap is the scripting capability. And real quickly, let's look at a couple of nmap scans of some devices that hopefully are familiar to you. I am not picking on any manufacturer. I'm simply using devices that I happen to have in my own plant. So of course we do an nmap scan of this particular host device, and of course no one can read the result, right? That's even just a snapshot of the amount of information that is produced. So let's see if we can blow that up a little bit. Well, we find that we have a few ports that are open, and of course each one of those unique port numbers is generally associated with a service that is being executed on that host device. In this case, it's an EAS decoder. If we look at those in particular, we also can find more information, including version numbers of the software that is used in those services. And to a hacker, that is valuable information, because if I know what version, let's say of SSH, that may be executing on a host, then I have also information about what are potential vulnerabilities of maybe that particular version. And of course, again, each of those unique port numbers is generally referenced to a service or associated with a service because it's a registered port number. And of course, another URL to look up those quickly. The barracks boxes have gotten a lot of press, let's say, in the broadcast trades about being hacked, and typically used in STL applications, and in a lot of cases the result is maybe the programming of that broadcast station gets changed. So what is so insecure about a barracks box? Well, we do an nmap scan of that, and gosh, we only find one port that is open, thus only one service that's running. That's the port 80, the HTTP port, which is how you access the browser to configure that box. So what's so insecure? Well, the problem with the barracks boxes is they have do not require a default login. They have no login. You have to go actively add that to them. And of course, a lot of times that does not happen. Anyone familiar with the Shodan website? This is one that is, I see one hand in the back and a big smile. So I won't ask you what have you been exploring on the Shodan website, but Shodan is a website that became popular as the Internet of Things movement grew momentum, particularly to explore webcams. Webcams that had not had their default information changed in them. And of course, that's expanded now to a wide list of categories. One of the things that you can do is to search for certain devices. And I see Gary in the back of the room, so I'm not picking on anyone here, but what if we did a scan of Nautel on that website? And we bring up several hosts on the open internet that seem to be associated with a Nautel transmitter. Well, the first step, in my humble opinion, we never should be able to find broadcast equipment like this on the open internet. It should be hidden. It should be protected. But we found some. Well, doing this scan back, let's say earlier in the year, there was one of those transmitters that still had the default login information. And if you own a Nautel product, you know what that login information is. And what does that get you? Well, it gets you the configuration interface, okay? And what might we do here? Well, we might reconfigure this transmitter. Maybe it should be on a new frequency. Okay? Maybe we just simply want to turn it off. Maybe we add some login information that's not the default. So again, can cause somebody a pretty bad day. So in closing, some takeaway points. Security is one of those things that I've often said is the perpetual employment act for broadcasting, because it never ends. It's a constant life cycle. It's important to understand the threats that exist. Certainly use best practices in the design of that network, to segment it, to layer it, to create zones, whatever terminology you like to use. You do that for security, you also do that for performance. And certainly, simply, aggressively lock everything down. Do not leave your door open at night, so to speak. And also remember the egress side of that network. And with that, I won't read through all of these, but just some generalized best practices to follow in terms of that network design. I would like to call reference to one particular document. It's got a very long, convoluted URL, but a Google search for FCC Working Group 4 will take you to this. Once you realize you've just downloaded a 500-ish page PDF, don't panic, because you're really only interested in section 9.1 of that document, which is maybe 30 to 40 pages. And with that, there are some very good reference diagrams of different size radio and television station environments, but there's also some checklists and some guidelines in terms of following the National Institute of Standards and Technology Cybersecurity guidelines. So our challenge as a broadcast engineer is to create a secure but usable environment. And with that, always remember there's more to networking than just hooking things up. So with that, I thank you for your time.
Actually, that was under Kelly's leadership, and it's CISRIC 4, Working Group 4, because CISRIC is now up to 6. Yeah. But yeah, that was a lot of fun with 120 people in a room trying to figure out how to document the 5 sectors of security, and there's a lot of good stuff in that report.
Thank you. Any questions? Great presentation. Please go to the microphone.
Wayne, I realize you didn't get into the applications layer here, but do you still use Kaspersky?
Well, again, continuing to follow the OSI model, application security is an area that should be taken into account. One of the areas that is often not is overlooked, and I think far as the future, that's going to be a growth area to address application security. I might make some predictions. There's been a lot of talk about ATSC3 over the course of the last few days. And of course, that is all an IP-based infrastructure that most likely will have a terrestrial interactive component to it. I'll at least make the prediction in a few years, a conference such as this one is going to probably have a lot of focus on cybersecurity in that broadcast environment because of that. But I think some of the keys are going to be some application security. One of the areas that I didn't mention, but has, I think, some traction in the industry is the IoT industry. Again, focused commonly on consumer-type devices, but that definition is expanding, have developed some security frameworks, and that might be some good guidelines for the broadcast industry to follow as well.